This report sets out the findings of the first ever joint investigation conducted by IBAC and the Victorian Ombudsman. We agreed to conduct this together following two referrals, from the Attorney General to IBAC, from the Legislative Council to the Ombudsman, following allegations of branch stacking involving misuse of public funds by certain moderate Labor members of Parliament. We emphasise that allegations of branch stacking on their own are not matters for integrity agencies. Our investigation was into how branch stacking resulted in the alleged misuse of public funds for party political purposes and subversion of parliamentary standards and processes.
Many people saw the evidence which emerged in public hearings last year. But in addition to the 7 public hearings, IBAC also held 26 private hearings, and the investigation team conducted voluntary interviews and reviewed many thousands of pages of documentary evidence. The evidence, both public and private, painted a compelling picture of jobs on the public purse according to factional loyalty and widespread misuse of public resources for political purposes.
Some elected officers, ministerial staff and aspiring MPs were plainly uncomfortable with the factional work they were being asked to do, but told us they felt powerless to resist. There was nowhere to complain. Others were willing participants in what they described as a long-standing cultural norm, where branch stacking was so embedded that the necessity of the practice and the misuse that went with it was simply taken for granted. Our report illustrates a catalogue of unethical and inappropriate behaviour and concerning practices, and the environment in which such behaviour was able to flourish. They range from the hiring of unqualified people into publicly funded roles, using those roles to support factional work, nepotism, forging signatures, bullying behaviours, and attempts to interfere with government grants to favour factionally aligned community organisations who, in some cases, failed to use the funds as intended. These factors and the nature of factional power struggles tend to confirm that misuse of public resources was not confined to one faction. And it was generally accepted in evidence that the culture allowing branch stacking to continue for so long gave rise to the real risk of corruption. But proof of the broader problem was more anecdotal. The evidence of branch stacking was not limited to one faction, but the evidence of misconduct only concerned the moderate Labor faction of the ALP. We had no specific evidence that allowed us to determine the extent of misuse by any other faction or make further findings of misconduct.
We concluded that 2 members of Parliament breached one or more elements of the Ministerial Code of Conduct and the Members of Parliament's Code of Conduct. While we saw evidence of disturbing practices engaged in by staff, most of who knew that what they were doing was wrong, primary responsibility rests with the Members of Parliament for whom they worked and their factional leaders. The unethical culture that was such a feature of this investigation, whether as an explanation or excuse for bad conduct, lies at its heart. Some Members of Parliament were perpetrators. Others presented as passive victims of that culture. Above all, we criticise a legislative framework that provides few, if any, consequences for abusing public resources, and that allows such conduct to continue unchecked. We have carefully considered whether the identified misconduct constituted criminal offending which should be referred to the Director of Public Prosecutions. Ultimately, while we consider the conduct to be egregious, the difficulties in proof and the state of the law are such that we cannot recommend prosecution. The investigation did not uncover examples of what might be termed traditional or black corruption, in which a decision maker dishonestly exercises their power for their own private gain or reward. The investigation was firmly within the zone of grey or soft corruption, in which decisions are made, rules are bent or broken for the benefit of a decision maker's friends, political organisations or networks. Grey corruption is characterised by questionable behaviour and decision making which involves a breach of integrity standards, but that does not necessarily amount to criminal conduct. However, its effect on public confidence in democracy and its institutions is deeply damaging.
During the investigation, we also received evidence that members of Parliament had breached various ALP rules, including rules against a person paying the membership fees for anyone other than a family member. Although such breaches were an integral component of branch stacking and formed part of the background to this investigation, breaches of internal party rules are outside the jurisdiction of IBAC and the Ombudsman. Accordingly, we make no findings about them. It will now be a matter for Parliament's Privileges Committees to decide whether the MPs have wilfully brought discredit upon Parliament. But the case for meaningful reform is now both compelling and urgent. My Red Shirts report highlighted the need for reform in 2018. The response was tepid, and this report highlights how little has changed. Allegations of bad behaviour by our elected representatives still generate a large number of media headlines. It is discouraging that so little parliamentary time across parties and Houses of Parliament has been devoted to improving ethical standards.
This investigation has exposed the continuing weaknesses of the Victorian parliamentary integrity model, especially the absence of an effective framework with which to support and enforce standards. Trust in our politicians is declining and will decline further if real action is not taken. Such action must include the clearest standards reflected unambiguously in codes of conduct, effective controls, and the cultural alignment to support those standards and controls. We propose a new Parliamentary Ethics Committee and an independent Parliamentary Integrity Commissioner who would investigate breaches of parliamentary ethical obligations. A new framework would include sanctions for breaches of standards and regularly audit of members of Parliament's use of allowances. Such a framework draws on the best parliamentary integrity models elsewhere in Australia and around the world, and would give Victoria the chance to lead the country once again.
This is not the first scandal to damage public confidence in our elected representatives. And if the opportunity for reform is not seized and acted upon, it will not be the last. Despite the findings of this report, we believe most members of Parliament, whatever their political affiliation, genuinely seek to advance the public interest. We encourage them to demonstrate this by supporting these reforms.
Thank you, Ombudsman. Thank you, Commissioner. We will now open the floor for questions. Please don't interrupt and ask questions in an orderly manner.
Can I just ask, you've recommended a Parliamentary Integrity Commission sort of model. Labor actually considered that in their first term and then never went ahead with that. What do you think this time will change the way they approach this? Is there anything that you can do to try to force their hand a little harder on this?
Well, I think this report is intended to do precisely that. You know, we have seen time and time again allegations of misbehaviour by our elected representatives. I think the case for reform is more compelling than ever, and I hope that the weight of this report and our investigation adds to that to that need.
Can I just also ask, with the grey area that you spoke of about grey corruption, given your investigation into the red shirts, do you think there might have been an opportunity to refer that matter to IBAC at the time, now that you look back on that, or was the decision not to do that?
I'm not here today to comment on the red shirts case. There will be an opportunity in future for that one.
Commissioner, can you just go? Can you go into
I might just add, I'm sorry, I might just add that a number of the senior witnesses that we examined recognised without qualification the need for significant parliamentary reform in this area. So we have some optimism that the reforms that we're proposing, notwithstanding they are quite significant and unique, that they will be embraced.
Are you talking, Commissioner, about the Premier, Daniel Andrews, and can you go into detail about what exactly he was questioned about during your investigation?
Well, in the report we have identified all of the significant parts of the Premier's evidence, including the fact that he expressed his support for the need for reform. So I was including the Premier in that answer, yes.
Patrick?
Would it be worth, just on that point, releasing the transcript of evidence with Daniel Andrews? If this was a company, and we've seen that with the Crown Royal Commission and the Hayne Royal Commission, ultimately responsibility lands with the CEO. So how much responsibility does the leadership bear, and how much can change without that changing? I think Adam Samurak himself said that when the Red Shirts report didn't recommend prosecutions, it sent a carte blanche signal for the culture to continue. So how confident are you of change, and how much responsibility rests with the leadership, the CEO or the Premier in this case?
Well, I start by saying that in every report that's tabled, or even if it's not a special report but just an outcome letter of the Commission, where recommendations are made, part of the Commission's task is to ensure, to the best of its ability, that those recommendations are implemented. So it goes without saying that the end of the road is still a long way from being arrived at. We will do all we can to ensure the recommendations are implemented. But as I said a moment ago, I have, and I believe the Ombudsman has, confidence that the Parliament will give serious consideration to these reforms. It is important, however, to distinguish between two things: the cultural issues, which we've explained in detail, which underlie why the misconduct occurred, the misuse of public resources, and the actual misconduct which constitutes serious offending. In relation to the cultural issues, of course, responsibility has to lie with leadership. But how that's dealt with is a matter for the ALP. We're talking about 70 years, according to some of the evidence. The culture of branch stacking is at least 70 years old, and I'm not going to revisit the detail, but it's a long-standing practice, and the responsibility for that must lie with leadership. The responsibility for misconduct, misuse of electoral allowances, is a different matter, and that depends, of course, significantly upon the extent of knowledge of individuals about whether those practices occur.
And I would just add to that the reason we make these significant recommendations for major reform is precisely because culture isn't going to be enough, and changes to culture are more likely to be reinforced by a really sound integrity framework. That's what we've focused on, and that's why the reforms are as they've been proposed.
Samaya.
Over the years, we've seen a weakening of parliamentary committees. We currently have a privileges committee. I guess what gives you confidence that a parliamentary ethics committee will be able to actually do what it's supposed to do?
Well, one of the things we're proposing for this new committee is that it contain non-members of Parliament on it. And that, we've seen this in elsewhere. The United Kingdom, for example, has parliamentary committees that have other than MPs sitting on it. And I think they help to give the public confidence that it isn't just the government protecting itself, as all too often the impression is when you see the Privileges Committee in action.
And what kind of non-MPs do you envision sitting on the committee?
These are areas that I think we'd be happy to explore with the government as and when we hope these proposals are accepted.
But would it be like judges or retired judges, preeminent?
Eminent members of the community who would be unquestionably seen as leaders in integrity would be the kind of people we would envisage on such a committee.
I think it's important to emphasise that the reforms should be viewed as a package, that one without the other will not likely be effective. So the role of the Integrity Commissioner working alongside the committee will be critical.
Are you able to talk to, I guess, how frustrating it is that you've done all this work, all these witnesses, and yet the legislative framework just isn't there for you to pursue any criminal charges? Is that frustrating for you?
So look, first thing I'd want to say is that it's not uncommon for my commission or other integrity commissions around Australia to undertake an investigation and at the conclusion of it find that no particular criminal offence has been committed. The value of those investigations is almost always in the institutional failings which are identified. So I'm not particularly troubled by the conclusion we've reached that we can't, in relation to the two principal former ministers who are the subject of significant findings, that we can't recommend to the Director of Public Prosecutions that a trial should take place. That said, it is important to emphasise that in this area of misuse of public resources, we're dealing with the offence of misconduct in public office. And that is a difficult offence to prove because one of the elements of the offence is that it requires a jury to be satisfied that the misconduct is of such a serious order that it should merit criminal punishment. And reasonable views will differ about whether the misconduct in a particular case meets that requirement. So because of the difficulties of proof, and for the other reasons that we've enunciated in the report, we can't make that recommendation.
But I think it's probably also fair to add that the reason for some of the significant recommendations that we make is because there should be a framework that identifies the kind of misconduct that we exposed in this report more clearly than we were able to do in this case.
Mark.
You said the evidence of misconduct and branch stacking was very broad, but a lot of it was anecdotal. Is that a reflection of there not being any evidence of misconduct in other factions, or a reflection of the limitations on your investigations?
To some extent, it is a reflection on the lack of specific evidence that came to us. Part of it is also a reflection on the poor record-keeping practices that operate. And even within the investigation, for example, including the faction that was very extensively investigated, you will have staff claiming that they made up for their factional work by working on their weekends, doing their day job. Now, impossible to prove or disprove, and the fact that those practices were so poor, and that exists across factions, presents people with an obvious defence around pursuing the extent to which such misconduct took place.
Samaya?
One of the issues after you released your red shirts.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. did
I'm
you-
sorry, I just want to add to that. I think it's important. I think there is a misunderstanding about the Commission's jurisdiction. Our jurisdiction's enlivened when we get a specific allegation of misconduct that may constitute a relevant offence. That can be investigated. We do not have a wide, unfettered jurisdiction to look at the subject matter of the complaint. And so it was that we were investigating, as we said in opening this conference, we said we were referred specific allegations which we had to investigate. And so that defined the scope of the investigation. As it turned out, as the Ombudsman has explained, we received no further complaints containing evidence of misconduct by other factions. Hence, the investigation was limited in the way I've explained.
Do you think you should have wider powers?
Only if government considers as a matter of policy that it's prepared to resource something like that, and it would be an extensive change to the way in which this and other commissions operate.
And I understand that's for the government to make, but given what you have found and given the limitations, do you wish you had been given the option to investigate this more broadly than just the specific complaint you received?
I'd rather limit my response to the findings and the way in which we've expressed ourselves in the report. I think it's a matter for others to determine whether or not there would be a need for any further consideration of the issues.
I would add to that we followed the evidence, and I think it's important to say that.
One of the issues, after you released your red shirts report was given none of the MPs were directed for, or none of the police hadn't investigated, no charges were laid. There was a culture that emerged inside the Labor Party that thought what they were doing was okay or was not bad enough, and they had only made limited changes to the legislation. And I understand that the legislative framework right now is weak to actually refer either Adam Somyurek or Marlene Kairos to the DPP. But Adam Somyurek, he's again tweeted that he feels exonerated. He's described the integrity agencies in a pretty derogatory manner. Do you think, given you've been unable to recommend either Somyurek or Kairos to the DPP, that might again create a culture that this is not as bad as what you have said it to be in your report?
Well, I think we're very clear that the conduct here is egregious. I mean, there's no shadow of a doubt, and I would not describe this report as an exoneration.
No, it's important to understand that we're dealing with a complex legislative framework. Now, we've set out in Chapter 3 the legislative framework that applies. Mr Somyurek relies upon one particular provision and disregards a large number of other provisions which arguably make sufficiently clear that under no circumstances can public resources be used other than for the purpose of enabling members of Parliament to discharge their public duties. And their public duties are twofold. One, to pursue the public interest so far as the community is concerned, and to also act in the interests of their constituents. That's their public duties, and the resources should not be used for any other purpose.
You've described the conduct as egregious, but can you maybe, what message would you send, I guess, MPs and aspiring MPs about what you found in the report?
Well, I think this report highlights the need for major change within Parliament around how it deals with its own ethics. You know, what we see time and time again are examples of unethical conduct that either gets referred to the Ombudsman or to IBAC or to both of us, or that gets referred nowhere, that can fundamentally undermine the public's faith in our democratic institutions. That cannot be good for politics across the board.
Your report looks at Labor though specifically. Does that apply to all parties, the Liberals, the Nationals as well? Because there have been branch stacking allegations levelled against those parties which you haven't investigated. Is it time for you to investigate those as well now?
I would have thought it's time for Parliament to get its house in order in relation to its own integrity rather than to launch further investigations. And that, that's the point that, again, we want to make, that these should not be matters for the Ombudsman or matters for IBAC or necessarily matters for the police. These should be matters for Parliament to be concerned about ethical standards and obligations, and that's what really needs to change here.
And what consequences should Adam Somyurek and Marlene Kairos face now? What can they face?
Well, they're the only avenues in the current system are for their conduct to be referred to the privileges committees, and that's what we expect to happen.
So it's essentially up to the MPs.
It will be up to Parliament.
And should they be kicked out of Parliament?
That's be a matter for those committees.
I'm just interested, I appreciate you've spelled out some significant legislative and parliamentary committee solutions. But this happened while Daniel Andrews and Anthony Albanese were in charge effectively of their parties in Victoria. I don't know if it's for both of you or one of you to answer, but what are the ethical obligations for the Premier and the Prime Minister right now to fix the culture as well as the mechanics of the problem? What's their ethical obligations?
Well, the Premier is, of course, the leader of the parliamentary Labor Party. He's not the leader of the Victorian branch of the ALP. Addressing the culture is a problem for the leadership of the branch. And as we said in the report, Mrs. Braxton Macklin have delivered a review which has made comprehensive, wide-sweeping proposals in terms of change. Whether they go far as they need to is a matter where views might differ. But that responsibility is quite different from the responsibility of ensuring that members of Parliament discharge their public duties and don't misuse their resources for other purposes. And the responsibility of individual members of Parliament, whether it's the Premier or a Minister or anyone else, can only arise to the extent that they have knowledge that resources are being misused. And so it's really important to distinguish in terms of culpability. It's really important to look at the findings in the report to see where culpability can lie in relation to knowledge with respect to misuse of resources. Important to keep a distinction between the two.
I understand that is difficult, but given you've termed the conduct of these two MPs egregious, and there are considerations for a jury, of course, why not just have a crack and put it before a court? But why not try?
It's always a difficult question to answer, one that we're often grappling with within the Commission. When one looks at a particular course of conduct and says, we think it unlikely that this would lead to a conviction, should we recommend to the Director of Public Prosecutions undertaking a trial which would be a very substantial one involving considerable resources, and ultimately one has to formulate a view about whether we think there's a significant chance that a prosecution would be successful. And as we've indicated, we've reached the conclusion it would not.
Opportunities to ask a question.
Commissioner, in the past on radio you've spoken about how shocked you are at the level of corruption at all levels of government. What specifically about this investigation were you speaking about in relation to that?
I'm not sure
Yeah.
I've
When you
got...
were speaking, you spoke on ABC Melbourne, you were speaking about how shocked you were at corruption at all levels of government.
Yes.
Were you speaking specifically about this investigation? What shocked you about this investigation?
I was certainly including this one. My views that I've already articulated are informed not merely by Operation Watts, but other investigations which haven't yet been completed, also influenced by the findings interstate. For example, the Coldrake review of the Queensland Crime Commission, recently published, events at a federal level, they've all informed my conclusions.
Samaya.
One of the things that your report also speaks of are the ongoing corruption risks. What are they?
Well, in relation to misuse of public funds, sorry, it's a slightly broad question.
Yes.
Would you like to sort of limit it?
Sorry, which I was hoping you
Yeah.
would narrow down. What do you think some of the ongoing corruption risks are, given you've been able to really examine in detail some of the more, I guess, egregious misuse of funds as part of this investigation?
Well,
Or
I
do you
think
there are ongoing corruption risks?
Well, there undoubtedly, and what we have seen repeatedly is when factional work or the party political work is able to continue unchecked for as long as it has been, that carries inherent corruption risks with it. And I think this report simply highlights the catalogue, and I don't think I need to repeat them, that we've exposed.
One of the, I guess, things that MPs will say to you or to us is that in order for an MP to remain in their job, they have to engage factionally, they have to engage with their branch members. And in order for an electorate officer to have their job, which was one of the evidence, they need to support their MPs in remaining in Parliament, but also being pre-selected. How do you overcome that grey area, and how do you make it far more black and white?
Well, there are lines that have been crossed, both in this case and in my Red Shirts report, and it's pretty clear what those lines are. So, part of what we're proposing here, in addition to the Parliamentary Integrity Commissioner and the Parliamentary Committee, are much clearer rules and guidance and enforceability around the roles of ministerial staff, electorate officers, and limitation, clarification of the Parliamentary Administration Act. There's as the Commissioner has said, there's a suite of reforms here that we would like to see implemented and not cherry-picked, but that taken as a package, they would address what we see as the broad corruption risks exposed by this case.
I think I'd be derelict if I didn't mention them. The saddest feature of this investigation was having to listen to young, aspiring people who saw a career for themselves in Parliament, who discovered that the only pathway to that objective was by engaging in this unethical factional behaviour. It was a really sad feature of the evidence that we uncovered, but it reflects the fact that the process that have now been so embedded for so long means that these young people start their careers with a distorted moral compass. And that's the thing that's got to be addressed. There has to be accountability by members of Parliament for maintaining ethical standards, and there has to be oversight of that accountability.
Thank you. We've got time for one more question.
So that was a very appropriate note upon which to end, actually, I thought.
Are there any further inquiries or investigations that might stem from what's been uncovered here, and or is it in Labor's hands? And just lastly, the evidence that was given in private, including Daniel Andrews, is there any reason that couldn't be released now in full? Because all we're seeing is an edited transcript of what you say is the most important aspects of that evidence.
I can't give you a definitive answer. I'll take that question and that request under advisement and give it some consideration.
But in relation to your first question, the answer is this matter is now concluded.